In this episode, I'm going to take a look back at the tradition of adding mini-games to D&D and how they can add focus to key moments in your campaign or adventure. I'll go over a few examples from classic D&D adventures, and then show you some mini-games I came up with for a couple of one-page dungeons I created. They'll be available for free in the description below. Of course, the first mini-game is to Save versus Justin. This is my well-worn and well-loved copy of the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. There's a lot of really inspiring stuff in this module. It was originally written as a tournament adventure by Harold Johnson and Jeff Leeson back in 1979, and I'd say its design was very formative for me for what should be included in a good D&D adventure. It literally drops the characters into a provocative Indiana Jones-style adventure, actually a couple of years before Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, and it immediately puts the players under a time pressure to escape. The combination of box text and keyed images sets up some memorable scenes and puzzles and really leans into exploration over combat encounters, which of course are there too. It was originally written for advanced Dungeons & Dragons, so several versions ago, and back then a lot of the mechanics that we're used to playing with today didn't exist yet. So game designers during this era would come up with their own situational rules or mechanics to drop in that help flesh out an encounter, and often add more tension to it. Sometimes these were pretty straightforward, like in the case of the Hidden Shrine. I'll note at this point that this episode will have some minor spoilers for several classic modules to help provide examples. In the Hidden Shrine, we have this room, the Court of Tamoachan. Kudos to Harold and Jeff for including a pronunciation guide. The doors to this room are bronze and are tinted blue with oxidation. A short hall ending in steps down leads to the central chamber. This chamber is flooded with a brackish water. The pool seems to be about 2 feet deep and covers the entire floor. A central hall flanked by narrow aisles is formed by 2 rows of massive square columns. The walls are coated with slime, and there are vile glowing lines etched across them. What the players will quickly learn is that this water is much deeper in some parts of the room, and if they aren't careful, they could slip in and drown, turning this room into a watery death trap. Of course, the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide does have swimming rules in its Underwater Adventures section. You can tell I got my copy when I was about 10 years old. I won't go too deeply into those rules, but basically swimming is hindered or impossible wearing certain armor. And it specifically states you can carry a dagger between your teeth, which is awesome. But the Hidden Shrine expands on this by adding drowning rules specific to this room. Here, if you fall into the water, there's a base chance to drown that's affected by your dexterity, but also how much damage you've taken and what kind of armor you're wearing. The walls are coated with slime, you get to roll percentage dice, it's a whole thing. And it's a whole thing because it's creating a spotlight on this very tense and dramatic moment of the adventure. It's one the players will remember. In more recent versions of D&D, a lot of those situations can be handled quickly, either by using specific rules or more often just using skill checks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can speed up gameplay by abstracting a lot of the minutiae of a task that may not be interesting to play out all the way. But sometimes you want to focus in on an encounter and treat it more like a plot point or a set piece to create a more memorable scene. I think that's what these games within a game are good at. By introducing a new mechanic, even a temporary one, you can mix things up and capture everybody's attention to get them to work together on a specific challenge. And we see this pretty often in those classic modules. Another great example is the Geyser room in the White Plume Mountain adventure. It takes place in this massive natural cave with a boiling mud pit below. And of course you need to get across to continue your quest or exploration. And to do that, you need to somehow navigate a series of platforms made from wooden discs, hanging from chains attached to their center, right so they'll tip if you try to stand on one edge without somehow stabilizing it first. This is D&D, so some characters might be able to fly, but probably not all of them. To make it even more deadly, geysers erupt at different points in the room at different intervals. So the minigame here is figuring out how to get the entire party across, and the challenge includes some custom mechanics on the chance to get knocked into the pit when the geysers erupt, based on your strength stat and how far you are from the geyser, as well as how much damage you'll take. The 5e reprint of White Plume Mountain and Tales from the Yawning Portal uses athletic skill checks and dexterity saving throws, but I'd say it still keeps to the spirit of the minigame while cutting down on unnecessary math. Still a very memorable and exciting encounter. The list goes on. Pharoah includes rules for escaping sinkholes in the desert during a hex crawl. The Isle of Dread has rules for a particularly cinematic fire trap in the temple on Taboo Island. Dwellers of the Forbidden City creates a refreshing alternative to a standard combat encounter by throwing in very detailed rules for a spotlight wrestling match, including dirty fighting. We go from wrestling to a boxing match in Castle Amber, where several rooms seem to have some kind of twist on the rules or unique situations that turn into minigames. There's also a room where you can have your fortune read, a couple of years before Ravenloft came out. In this cool room, more characters will spell out words as they walk across to various amusing effects. These minigames were everywhere, and I guess my point is that DMs should feel empowered to create encounters like these that let you play with the rules a bit. In fact, it might be a great way to experiment with tweaks or changes that could lead to new house rules for your table, in a kind of contained sandbox. I've played around with this several times myself. Recently in one of my campaigns, actually based on the Isle of Dread, the characters encountered a shrine with a pool that reflected things that may or may not be real, like visions or hallucinations. My players were having a lot of fun with that, so on the fly I added a sanity mechanic based on Cthulhu Dark, which I had just recently played in. I put a 6-sided dice in front of one of the players who was particularly affected by these visions, and I placed it so that the 1 was facing up. Whenever that character was in a stressful situation or was actively engaging in crazy talk, I had him roll another d6. If he got a 1 on that die, then the sanity die that I placed in front of him bumped up to a 2, and then something strange would happen. And then the next time I called for a sanity roll, it would affect him if he got a 1 or a 2, and then the sanity die would bump up to a 3, and so on, creating this kind of slow but accelerating spiral. I bring that up just as an example of how you might mix in mechanics from other systems as mini-games to try out in your D&D campaign. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I included links in the description below for 2 one-page dungeons I created for the one-page dungeon contest that also include mini-games. I think one-page dungeons are a good place for these because they're often written as system-neutral adventures, so you can't rely on certain rules being in place when people run them. This first one is called Yay We Won! So now what? It was actually the 2023 one-page dungeon contest winner. The setup is this. The party just slayed a Dracolich in the ruins of Dwemerhold and claimed its treasure. Huzzah! But during the battle, the ruins collapsed and sent them all plummeting deep underground. The goal is, escape the dungeon beneath the ruins while hauling out as much treasure as you can. But to make that interesting, I included this mini-game on the side. Right, the party starts with 20 treasure, kind of an abstracted amount. If a character fails a roll that they really want to succeed in, they can, but it will cost the party 1 treasure. If a character would die, they can cheat death by sacrificing 3 treasure. To add more pressure, the dungeon is starting to flood. For every 60 minutes of real life, thank you Shadow Dark, 1 level of the dungeon floods. If the party's on that level when it does flood, they have to scramble to escape and they lose d6 treasure. Then, at the end of the adventure, if the party escapes, there's some epilogue questions that are affected by the total number of treasure that the party escapes with. As you can tell, I mixed in elements from both Shadow Dark and this board game called Forbidden Island to set the stakes for the adventure and add some time pressure. The other one-page dungeon I included is called Vicious Cycle. That one was an honorable mention in the 2024 one-page dungeon contest. This one combines a hex crawl with a quest and a 5-room dungeon. In this one, the adventurers are chosen to make an offering at the fairy ring to protect their village from the dragon Grondelmere. This offering needs to be the antlers from a mythical stag named Greenheart. The characters need to travel across the hex map, then return with the antlers while the dragon hunts them. Here I added a minigame to try to keep the map dynamic and living. Each day you roll to see which hex the dragon hunts in, and also where the stag hides. Then the adventurers can move to an adjacent hex, and roll to see if there's a threat, a discovery, as well as the mood of the hex. The trick is that once you've encountered something, you cross it off. And if you roll that number again, you bump the result up to the next available highest number. This creates a system that eventually escalates to the highest numbers, which of course includes the dragon moving towards the adventurers. You can even cut out these little counters to track where everything is. You know, YouTube is also kind of like a minigame. You click the thumb, it adds points. You can subscribe for bonus points, it feeds the algorithm, everybody wins. Have you tried mixing in minigames into your adventures and campaigns? If you have, did your players like them, or did they find them disruptive? Let's chat about it more in the comments below, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.